The night air hung thick as molasses over Beaumont Manor on Christmas Eve, 1852, when the blood of 3 generations would finally answer for sins written in flesh and bone. While carolers sang of peace on earth in the grand parlor below, death moved through the corridors with the quiet precision of a man who had learned patience from 27 years of chains. His name was Solomon, though they had tried to steal even that from him, and tonight he would become both judge and executioner in a courtroom built from cypress wood and Confederate pride. The masters celebrated their Savior's birth with champagne and cruelty, never knowing that their own reckoning walked among them, carrying the weight of every lash, every stolen child, every broken promise like stones in his pockets. Solomon had been the coachman, the invisible man who drove their secrets through Charleston's cobblestone arteries, who heard their confessions of flesh and felt their sins seep into his very bones through proximity to power. Tonight those secrets would die with them, one by one, in rooms where screams had echoed for generations but were always ignored. He was not just a man seeking vengeance, he was memory incarnate, the living repository of every horror the Beaumont bloodline had authored. And as the clock tower chimed midnight, announcing the birth of their Lord, Solomon would deliver them all into the arms of their true maker. Before we continue with this tale of reckoning, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because these are the stories they tried to bury, and we're here to resurrect every last one. The Beaumont estate sprawled across 300 acres of stolen Cherokee land like a cancer dressed in white columns and rose gardens. Inside the manor house, crystal chandeliers cast dances, hanging shadows on walls lined with portraits of dead patriarchs, their painted eyes following visitors with the cold gaze of men who had built fortunes on human misery. The aroma of roasted turkey and bourbon mingled with the underlying scent of fear that permeated every plantation, though the white folks had long since stopped noticing how terror seasoned their every meal. In the grand dining room, Master Charles Beaumont raised his glass to toast another profitable year, his face flushed with wine and satisfaction. Around the mahogany table sat his son William, a young man already drunk on inherited cruelty, and his brother-in-law, Judge Morrison, whose courtroom had become a marketplace where justice was auctioned to the highest bidder. Their laughter echoed off imported marble floors, a grotesque symphony that had played every holiday for decades while children shivered in the quarters, listening to their parents weep for babies sold downriver. But tonight, something different stirred in the December air. The wind through the Spanish moss carried whispers of change, and the very foundations of the house seemed to pulse with anticipation. In the kitchen, pots boiled unattended while the help moved with unusual purpose, their eyes holding secrets that would soon bloom into terrible fruit. The fire in the hearth burned too bright, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called 3 times, a sound that made the old ones pause and remember prophecies spoken in languages the white folks had tried to murder. Even the portraits seemed to lean forward from their frames, as if the painted patriarchs sensed that their legacy of blood was about to demand payment in kind. The very air thrummed with the energy of reckoning, though the masters, fat and drunk on their own invincibility, remained blissfully unaware that Diomos had already entered their house and was even now selecting his instruments with the care of a master craftsman. Solomon had been born free in the mountains of North Carolina, where his grandmother taught him the old ways, how to read the stars like scripture and draw healing from roots and bitter bark. His real name had been Kofi, gifted to him by parents who traced their bloodline back to Ghana's golden kingdoms. But that identity had been the first thing stolen when raiders tore him from his family at 13. The Beaumonts had purchased him at Charleston's slave market like livestock, examining his teeth and muscles before branding their initials into his left shoulder with iron heated until it glowed like a fallen star. For 14 years he had driven their carriages through Charleston's elegant streets, his hands steady on the reins while his ears absorbed every whispered confession, every cruel laugh, every casual discussion of human flesh bought and sold like sugar or cotton. They spoke freely in front of him because to them he was furniture, a useful object with no more consciousness than their mahogany dining table or crystal decanters. This willful blindness to his humanity had become their fatal mistake. For Solomon remembered every word, every name, every detail of their crimes with the precision of a man whose survival depended on understanding his captors completely. He had loved once. Her name was Keturah, and she carried his child for 7 months before Master Charles decided her value lay not in motherhood, but in the auction block. Solomon had begged on his knees, had offered his own life in exchange, but Charles had laughed and reminded him that neither his woman nor his unborn child belonged to him. They were property, nothing more. He had watched them load Keturah onto a wagon bound for New Orleans, her belly round with their future, her eyes holding his until distance swallowed her completely. The night after her sale, Solomon had tried to hang himself from the oak tree where they whipped the field hands. But the rope had broken. Some said it was divine intervention. Others claimed it was his grandmother's protective magic working through time and space. He had awakened on the ground with dirt in his mouth and murder in his heart, understanding finally that death would be too easy an escape. The ancestors wanted him alive. They wanted him to become their instrument of justice. Over the years, he had learned to read their patterns like scripture. Master Charles preferred young girls no older than 15, visiting the quarters on nights when his wife traveled to Columbia. William had inherited his father's appetites but added his own innovation. He enjoyed breaking the men who tried to protect their women, forcing them to watch as he violated their daughters and wives. Judge Morrison funded his political career by selling slave families to different states, deliberately separating children from parents to maximize his profits from desperation. Solomon had cataloged their sins like a bookkeeper recording debts, knowing that someday the ledger would demand balancing. He had learned which plants his grandmother had taught him could stop a heart without leaving marks, which tools from the carriage house could split skulls quietly, which rooms in the manor house muffled screams most effectively. Knowledge became his weapon, patience his armor, and memory his ammunition in a war they had declared on his humanity decades ago. The opportunity had crystallized 3 months earlier when William announced his engagement to Sarah Morrison, the judge's daughter, a union that would consolidate 2 of the region's most powerful slave-owning families. The wedding was planned for New Year's Day, but Christmas Eve would be their last supper. Solomon had spent weeks preparing, gathering what he needed, studying their habits until he could predict their movements with clockwork precision. Tonight, when they were drunk and careless, when the house staff was busy with holiday preparations, when screams might be mistaken for celebration, he would collect what was owed. Each tool had been selected with surgical precision. The carriage axe, sharpened until it could split silk scarves, would be his primary instrument. The small vials of nightshade extract, derived from plants growing wild in the cemetery where slave children lay in unmarked graves, would ensure that any who survived the initial violence would not live to raise alarms. He had even prepared explanations for the house staff, loyal allies who had suffered under Beaumont cruelty for generations, and would help him escape into the network of safe houses that stretched like invisible spider webs through the Carolina Lowcountry. He moved through his preparations with the methodical calm of a man performing sacred ritual. This was not murder. This was justice delayed but never denied. This was the voice of every ancestor who had died in chains, speaking through his hands and heart. As he tested the weight of the axe and felt its perfect balance, Solomon understood that he was no longer just a man seeking revenge. He had become something larger, more terrible, and infinitely more necessary than the sum of his individual pain. He had become the instrument through which generations of accumulated suffering would finally find release. The clock struck 11 as Solomon made his final preparations, checking each weapon one last time before concealing them beneath his Sunday coat. In 1 hour, the Beaumont bloodline would learn that some debts could only be paid in blood, and that the slaves they had dismissed as less than human had been watching, learning, and remembering everything. Tonight, memory would become their executioner. Christmas Eve dinner at Beaumont Manor had always followed the same ritual: excessive courses of food purchased with human misery, toasts to Confederate prosperity, and drunken speeches about the natural order that placed white men at the apex of creation. Tonight followed tradition until the moment it didn't, until the moment Solomon appeared in the doorway of the dining room like death dressed in servant's clothing, the carriage axe gleaming dully in his massive hands. Master Charles looked up from his brandy with the mild annoyance of a man accustomed to absolute obedience, his mouth opening to deliver some casual cruelty. But the words died on his lips as he registered the expression in Solomon's eyes, not the carefully crafted blankness of survival, but something ancient and implacable that made his blood turn to ice in his veins. For the first time in his 53 years of life, Charles Beaumont understood what it meant to be prey. "You taught me many things," Solomon said, his voice carrying the weight of decades, each word falling like hammer blows in the suddenly silent room. "You taught me that mercy is weakness. You taught me that power means taking what you want from those who cannot resist. You taught me that some people matter and others are just property to be used and discarded." He stepped into the room and William reached for the bell cord to summon help, but Solomon's voice stopped him. "Most importantly, you taught me that screaming doesn't bring salvation." "I learned that lesson well." The axe rose and fell with the precision of a woodsman splitting kindling, but this was no tree he was felling. This was the poisonous root from which generations of cruelty had grown. Charles Beaumont's scream cut through the Christmas night like a knife, but it lasted only seconds before being replaced by the wet sound of steel meeting bone and the terrible finality of justice delayed but never denied. William tried to run, stumbling over his chair in wine-drunk panic, but Solomon moved with the fluid grace of a man who had spent years loading and unloading cargo, his muscles trained by forced labor into instruments of devastating efficiency. The second blow caught William at the base of his skull, dropping him to the imported Persian rug, where his blood bloomed like dark roses against the intricate patterns woven by hands that had never known freedom. Judge Morrison, sobered instantly by terror, pressed himself against the wall and began to babble promises, freedom, money, safe passage to the north. But Solomon silenced him with a look that contained every whipping, every separated family, every child sold away from sobbing mothers. "You want to make a deal?" Solomon asked, his voice eerily calm as he approached the man who had made a fortune trafficking human souls. "Let me tell you about the deal you made with my woman and child. Let me tell you about the deal you made with every family you tore apart for profit." The judge died harder than the others, and Solomon made sure he understood why each cut was necessary, each blow a response to a specific cruelty recorded in the ledger of his perfect memory. The man who had twisted justice into a marketplace for human flesh died slowly, his expensive clothing soaking up blood like his courtroom had soaked up tears for decades. When it was finished, Solomon stood in the ruins of their Christmas feast, breathing evilly but feeling lighter than he had in years. The silence was profound, not the oppressive quiet of suppressed humanity, but the clean emptiness that comes after a terrible burden has finally been lifted. He wiped the axe clean on Charles Beaumont's silk vest and looked around the room where 3 generations of casual evil had planned their cruelties over fine wine and imported delicacies. The house staff found him there an hour later, sitting calmly at the head of the table with his hands folded, surrounded by the bodies of his oppressors. They looked at the carnage without surprise. They had all known this night would come eventually, had felt it building like pressure before a hurricane. Some crossed themselves and whispered prayers of gratitude. Others simply nodded and began discussing how to clean the blood from surfaces that had witnessed so many other violations over the decades. The authorities arrived at dawn, summoned by a neighbor who had noticed the unusual silence from a plantation that typically rang with the sounds of celebration until the early morning hours. They found Solomon exactly where the house staff had left him, still wearing his Sunday coat, still radiating the terrible calm of a man who had finally balanced a ledger written in human suffering. He offered no resistance as they bound his hands with the same chains they had used to transport him as a boy, understanding that this too was part of the ritual that had to be completed. At his trial, Solomon spoke only once, when the prosecutor asked him to explain his actions to the court. He stood with the dignity of a man who had reclaimed his own humanity through violence, and his voice carried to every corner of the packed courtroom when he said, "They taught me how." 4 words that contained libraries of pain, decades of observation, and the cold logic of justice applied without murks. And to those who had never shown any, the jury deliberated for exactly 17 minutes, long enough to maintain the pretense of civilized process, but not long enough to suggest any real doubt about the outcome. They found him guilty of triple murder and recommended hanging, though several jurors later admitted they had struggled to see the crime in killing men who had authored so much casual cruelty. The judge who sentenced him was Morrison's replacement, a younger man who had grown wealthy selling the children of slaves to brothels in New Orleans, and his hands shook as he pronounced the death penalty. Solomon accepted his sentence with the same quiet dignity he had displayed throughout the trial, understanding that his death would complete the transformation from man to legend. He had known from the moment he picked up the axe that he was trading his life for something larger, a story that would outlive them all, a whisper that would follow every master-class family for generations, a reminder that even the most powerless retained the ultimate power to demand payment for their suffering. On a cold January morning, they led Solomon to the gallows they had erected in Charleston's main square, the same location where they had auctioned human flesh for decades. Hundreds gathered to witness the execution, some coming to celebrate what they saw as justice, others drawn by the terrible fascination of watching a man die for reclaiming his humanity through violence. But Solomon walked to his death like a king approaching his coronation, his head high and his eyes fixed on something beyond the crowd, beyond the rope, beyond the world that had tried so hard to break him. His last words entered local folklore immediately. "Tell your children that some debts carry interest, and some accounts can never be settled with anything but blood." The rope snapped his neck cleanly, but his death birthed something more dangerous than any living man. It created a ghost story that would haunt plantation houses across the South, a whispered legend that reminded every master-class family that their servants were watching, remembering, and calculating the cost of generations of cruelty. In the slave quarters throughout the Carolina Lowcountry, Solomon's name became a prayer and a promise. Mothers would tell their children about the coachman who had finally made the masters pay, and fathers would point out that even the most powerless man could become justice incarnate when pushed beyond the boundaries of human endurance. His story spread through the underground networks that connected every plantation, carried by visiting preachers and traveling craftsmen, until it reached communities hundreds of miles away. The Beaumont estate was sold at auction within 6 months, the new owners unable to find house staff willing to work in rooms where blood had soaked so deeply into the floorboards that no amount of scrubbing could remove the stains. The manor house stood empty for decades, gradually succumbing to kudzu and decay until it became nothing more than a pile of rubble overgrown with vegetation, nature reclaiming what had been stolen from the Cherokee generations earlier. But Solomon's legacy lived on in ways the architects of his execution could never have anticipated. His story became a whispered instruction manual, teaching other enslaved people that resistance was possible, that justice could be claimed even by those the law refused to protect. Plantation owners throughout the region began sleeping with loaded pistols beside their beds, started tasting their food more carefully, began looking at their human property with new wariness as they wondered which of their slaves might be the next Solomon, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to balance the books. What violence is buried beneath the sugar in our coffee cups, the cotton in our clothes, the wealth that built our greatest cities? Whose screams became the seasoning for our national prosperity? Whose blood watered the roots of our economic system? Solomon's story reminds us that every act of oppression creates its own response, every cruelty authors its own revenge, and every system built on human suffering contains the seeds of its own destruction. His tale lives on not as a celebration of violence, but as a testament to the unbreakable human spirit and the terrible mathematics of justice delayed but never denied. In a world that tried to reduce human beings to property, Solomon reclaimed his humanity through the most primal form of resistance available to him, becoming a symbol of defiance that would inspire generations of freedom fighters long after his body had returned to the earth from which all justice springs. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth. It really helps the channel keep bringing real stories that never make it into the history books, because these are the voices that were silenced but never truly killed.